Previously on Ty's Hot Mess History.
In May of 1938, Madeleine was staying in Palm Beach and finally decided to go a step further than the separation and file for divorce. She did so on the grounds of extreme cruelty, citing that he, 1, had knocked her down, and I didn't know if that was in reference to the incident before they got married in which he broke her arm, but 2, broke her wrist, 3, hit her with a fist after a dance, and 4, was exceedingly unpleasant. Now, I said that I wasn't sure what Madeleine meant about her charge that Enzo had once knocked her down. As we know, he knocked her down to the floor and broke her arm before they got married, remember? She was in the hospital recovering from the broken arm when she said "I do" to him. Well, I first learned about her accusations against Enzo in a book that I will list in my sources for this video series. Well, that led me to do some digging, and this is what I found. This article that was printed in the Daily News Sunday edition on June 12, 1938, called "Enzo Beat Her, Says Rich Wife." And I'm going to share several passages with you from this article in part 6.
So now it's time for us to get down to the details. I can say, this writer did not waste any time ripping Enzo's character to shreds, writing on the front page caption, quote, "The punch so sadly lacking in Enzo Fiermonte's ring life was much in evidence in his domestic life." End quote. Well, it might sound shady, but it was true. Enzo was not the world's greatest boxer by any stretch of the imagination, but he never had a problem landing a punch on Madeleine. According to Madeleine and the few friends who were in her tight circle, punching Madeleine wasn't even the worst of what he had done to her. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload one of these videos or every time that I live stream. And hit that like button to support this video. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. Now that Madeleine had been quickly granted her divorce, the way that the papers had been harping on her for looking old, they were now harping on her ex-husband for having been a terrible boxer. Here's how the story of the divorce begins. Quote, "Accounts of the closely guarded decision, reaching here from West Palm Beach, revealed that Enzo used on the Astor widow the uppercuts and left hooks that he failed to deliver in the American prize ring." End quote. Madeleine's accounts of Enzo's abuse were substantiated in court by her own sister, a maid who had worked for her and Enzo, and her physician. These are the accounts that include the charges that Madeleine put forth against Enzo when she filed for her divorce. The first sign of trouble occurred only 7 months into the marriage in June of 1934, when Enzo wanted $50,000. Madeleine didn't give him the money he wanted, so in response, he left their home in New York City altogether. He went off gallivanting in several places with several women. At least one of those places was California. He returned home when he was ready. Early the next year, in 1935, more than half a year later. Then, who can forget their magical reconciliation after he ran away from her? Or so he thought, only to find that she had made her way onto his escape cruise to Italy. Well, the papers printed the story of how they got back together, but in court, Madeleine told what the reporters didn't know. Quote, "The reconciliation was short-lived," the divorce papers showed yesterday. For on the boat, Enzo committed sundry acts of extreme cruelty. He on several occasions struck the plaintiff, knocking her down. Mrs. Fiermonte related that she was ill at the time, and her illness was augmented by his acts of violence. End quote. Then, while they were in Italy, when Madeleine shelled out an extra $17,000 on top of the $10,000 that she had already paid in order to, quote-unquote, keep Enzo, yes, on that same trip, he left her at their hotel in Naples while he went out with other women. That was the same time in Europe that Enzo and Madeleine fled their hotel because his first wife came looking for him and raising hell at their hotel because she wanted him back. You might remember that Enzo and Madeleine took his new sports car to France, and that made for a cute little romantic story to put in the newspapers. But here's what happened while they were there. Quote, "While in Paris, they went to a rustic restaurant 60 miles out from the metropolis. Enzo left her and drove away in their car. Night fell. Mrs. Fiermonte had no idea how to get back to Paris, and finally began making inquiries. At this juncture," her complaint narrated, "the defendant returned, became enraged because she had spoken to anyone about being stranded, knocked her down, breaking her right wrist." End quote. This whole time that she had been fighting Enzo's first wife to get custody, if you will, of Enzo, Enzo was beating her and cheating on her. Did she just need to have a win against his first wife for the sake of her ego? Anyway, then, in Nice, he deserted her once again, not at a restaurant this time, on the waterfront. When he finally drove up to get her, he was teasing her, making her follow the car. You know the thing where someone comes to open the car door, then the driver scoots the car up just enough so that the person trying to get in can't grab the handle to open the door? That's what he was doing. And she testified that it went on until she had walked quite a distance. The following summer, the couple returned to the United States and lived in New York, Hot Springs, and Charleston, and in all three places the beatings continued, or as the Daily News described them, ring caresses. But this is what led up to what Madeleine called a grand assault in Newport, Rhode Island. The Fiermontes were visiting Madeleine's sister, Catherine. She was also a socialite who had married a rich man. They all went to a dance together. Then, according to Madeleine and her sister, when they returned to their room, Enzo, completely unprovoked, struck Madeleine after having had a night out that everyone agreed was just a really nice time. This time he was said to have knocked her down and bruised her. I find it odd that she called this the grand assault, considering that up until this point he had already broken her arm and broken her wrist. Because I do see Madeleine as someone who had an ego problem, I wonder if this occasion was the grand assault, as she put it, because it happened in front of people she knew, people in front of whom she had been pretending that her marriage with Enzo was a happy one. Then, she didn't even go into details about almost the whole year of 1937. She just said that he had become exceedingly unpleasant, striking her often and being otherwise cruel. But there was one date that she called out specifically, which clearly was her breaking point, a date in 1937. Here is what the Daily News printed, quote, "On August 4th, 1937, the warring pair sailed for Europe again. In Paris, Enzo beat her inhumanly, demanding money, claiming she had neglected to pay his monthly cash allowance. Her long-suffering endurance of his conduct was finally exhausted, and after a trip to Vienna, she returned to the United States alone." End quote. Enzo didn't even bother showing up to court to deny the allegations on his own behalf. By Madeleine's day in court, Enzo's attorney had already made arrangements for Enzo to receive roughly 1/3 of a severance settlement that she had promised to pay him. So he was living it up in France with some women who were in his car when he crashed it. We'll get to that. But many of the newspapers ran the stories of Madeleine's divorce and Enzo's car crash side by side on the same pages, some even joking that it was good that he had the rest of Madeleine's settlement money coming his way because he would need to use most of it to pay off the victims that he had injured with his reckless driving. Yes, there was a severance package that no attorney, no judge, or any jury required her to pay Enzo. Even with all of these allegations claimed against him, she still sent him off with a severance package, a final settlement of $150,000, which is equivalent to roughly $3.2 million today. Was this one last attempt to buy his love? Maybe, but it really did seem like she just wanted to be done. And now that Enzo had such a big chunk of her money, he seemed to be okay with being done. He'd never had so much of Madeleine's money at one time. She would spend money on him, but not give it to him. She'd buy him whatever he wanted. For instance, when she purchased her home on 600 acres in South Carolina, he wanted a few minor upgrades: a tennis court, a dog racing track, a yacht dock, and a skeet field. She willingly granted him all of those luxuries, anything that he could enjoy at home with her. He was given expensive gifts and allowances of thousands of dollars at a time in the past, but with this small fortune, this $150,000 settlement from Madeleine, he could finally break away, stop pretending he loved Madeleine, and do what and who he wanted. And that's just what he did, and didn't waste any time doing it. Enzo got out of New York and went back to Europe. This time, he didn't have to sneak away like a thief in the night, and Madeleine didn't follow him to surprise him this time either. He was living it up in France with as many women as he wanted to see. Madeleine was finally done with him. But guess who wasn't? Tosca, wife number one. As is told in a Brooklyn Daily Eagle story from 1938, appropriately titled Waiting Wife. At this point, Enzo was being called a motor car speedster boxer. Well, we know that he liked to speed and box the people who reported on it, so I guess that's fair. Now, this was all literally happening at the same time that Madeleine was being granted her divorce from Enzo. Tosca declared to the press that Enzo was the only man she ever loved or will love, and she said that she'd be happy to take him back after he was done having his fun with other women. Well, it's good that she knew that she would need to wait her turn, because either on the day or the day after the divorce was finalized, Enzo was in the papers because he was driving his sports car in France in a village near Dijon with not one, not two, but 3 women. Unfortunately for one of those young beauties, she was injured in a car accident that Enzo caused when he was speeding and crashed his sporty car right into a tree, causing the car to overturn, thus injuring Marion Whitworth, a 26-year-old actress whose brother had died years before in an auto accident. This accident earned him another prison sentence. And knowing all of that, wife number one still wanted him back. Well, that car wreck was on him and had nothing to do with Madeleine. She had divorced him and even paid him well after she had suffered years of beatings. So that would be it, right? Wrong. The very next year, in 1939, Enzo would serve her one more blow, but it wouldn't come from his fist this time, though she probably would have preferred a punch instead of what he did. Before spring could even get underway, Enzo had sold the story of his marriage to a publication called True Story magazine. Every embarrassing detail of how Madeleine had been a fool for him, how she paid to keep him because she didn't think that she could get anybody else, how she knew that her looks were fading, how she knew that other women wanted her husband, and how she knew that other women were having her husband, and how she felt too insecure to compete with them because she had lost her beauty. All of it was available for the world to read in the February, March, and April issues of True Story in a series called Kept Husband. It was labeled as, quote, one of the most startling and illuminating commentaries on life among the idle rich ever written, end quote. And Madeleine couldn't take it. Whatever people had only suspected before, they now knew. It was what they had imagined and worse. The little bit of a reputation she had was now in shambles. She slipped into a deep depression, and she wanted to end her life. She grew more and more dependent on prescription drugs throughout 1939. The following year, in January of 1940, she left her home in Charleston to go back to Palm Beach. In what had been a life full of trips, that would be her last one. On March 27th of the same year, she died at the age of 46. Very close to the age of her husband who had died on the Titanic, John Jacob Astor was 47. Her official cause of death was heart failure, but her friends believed that she had intentionally overdosed on pills. Her estate was worth $1.1 million when she died, and that was split equally between the two sons she had with her second husband, William Carl Dick. She figured that John Jacob Astor, the Titanic baby, would have had more than he needed from the trust that his father's Titanic death had left him. As for her final husband, Enzo Fiermonte's words on her death, quote, "Madeleine carried her doubts with her always, like her pearls," end quote. Okay, whatever that means. He went on to live out his dreams. He wanted to be an actor, and he appeared in over 100 movies and TV shows from the 1940s until the 1980s. Now, I don't know any of the films listed in his IMDb profile. Some of them are Italian, but I see that among dozens of roles, he played military men of various ranks, a boxer, a character named Enzo, and even Al Capone. How's that for life? Enzo was never really into Madeleine, and he wasn't too fond of her firstborn son either, calling the younger John Jacob a poor little rich boy. Though Madeleine didn't leave her first son any money, she did leave him 2 pieces of her jewelry, a pearl necklace that was valued at just over $1,500, and a diamond solitaire ring that was worth over $50,000. I'd like to think that those pieces had sentimental value. She was almost always photographed wearing a 2-strand pearl necklace. Perhaps the ring was the one that John Jacob used to propose to her. That would have been touching if those were the 2 pieces that she was able to leave to her son. He was the baby who Madeleine was carrying on the Titanic, who she named after his father. He was also John Jacob Astor, but he was also known as the Titanic baby. And even though he was born into wealth, he had a lot of troubles of his own. If you want to know the story of that little brat who was once labeled in a headline as the rich boy nobody wants, let me know in the comments section. Madeleine Forrest Astor Dick Fiermonte was not the only woman in history to have been a fool for love. She won't be the last. Someone who could have related to her was Betty Lou Williams. She was a 1940s and 50s circus freak show performer who also gave a lot of her money to a man who she thought loved her. I published a video about her that you can see here. I will also leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for this story are Garrett Clipper Archives 1933, Shadow of the Titanic by Andrew Wilson, the Minneapolis Star Archives 1933, Express.co.uk, the Brooklyn Citizen Archives 1933, Princeton Daily Clarion Archives 1933, the Cameron Sun Archives 1933, Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives 1933, 1934, 1937, and 1938. Democrat and Chronicle Archives 1939, Lancaster New Era Archives 1939, Daily News Archives 1933, 1934, 1935, 1938, and 1939, the Buffalo News Archives 1934 and 1935, and the Star Gazette Archives 1935. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.